Hello, my name is Daryl Anka, and for the past 40 years I have been channeling an extraterrestrial entity that we call Bashar. Bashar is a first contact specialist from his civilization, which is called Esasani, which is in a parallel reality. If we were to overlap their reality with ours, his planet would be about 500 light years in the direction of the Orion constellation. He's brought through a lot of information to us over the last 40 years, and we're going to explore and share some of that information today in this series. My experience with him began in 1973 when I had 2 broad daylight UFO sightings here over Los Angeles, which started investigating the idea of what that was all about and led me to the understanding that Bashar and I have made an agreement to do this channeling before this life. So we would like to present that information to you in this series.
And I'll say good day to you this day of your time. How are you?
There was an early form that you all branched off from, but eventually a hominid form, something similar to what you have labeled Homo erectus, evolved naturally on your planet. At that point, several 100,000 of your years ago, an extraterrestrial species that called themselves the Anu did in fact come to your world, and they were in search of certain minerals to assist them in the balancing of the atmosphere of their own world. Realizing what a monumental task it was, they decided to inject their own DNA, being master geneticists, into several of the hominid species that had evolved to a certain point and were similar enough to them to transform into those that could help them in this endeavor. Thus, they created from the original hominid form what came to be understood now as Homo sapiens.
Welcome. I'm going to tell you a story about humanity. And like any good story, we need to start at the beginning. A lot of people want to know what the beginning was like for humanity. So after channeling for 40 years, the information has often been asked, where did we come from? The way the story goes from the information gathered from the channeling is as follows. Many hundreds of thousands of years ago, the natural hominid that evolved upon the earth, that we often refer to as Homo erectus, existed, and at one point, the story goes, an extraterrestrial race visited the earth. They came to earth to mine minerals that would help them create a balance on their planet. And in taking on this task, they began to realize that it was quite daunting and would take a long time, longer than they had. It was very important to balance out the weather on their planet with the minerals for a very, very short period of time. And so they needed help in order to do this. They began to look around and saw the natural hominids that had evolved here, who were close enough physically to the extraterrestrials that they thought perhaps if we can somehow train them to be of assistance in mining these minerals, the task will go faster. But being master geneticists, they felt that a way to accomplish this would be to take their own genetics and inject them into the hominids and create them to be a little bit more like the extraterrestrial race so they would be easier to train, so that they would be able to understand what the task was all about and help the extraterrestrials, who were called the Anu, or the Anunnaki. So they undertook a program of genetic alteration where they introduced their own genetics into Homo erectus and other early hominids and began to create what became us, Homo sapiens. A lot of people talk about the idea of evolution, and they talk about the idea of thinking that there must have been a kind of missing link between early hominids and Homo sapiens, because there seems to be an evolutionary jump that occurred where suddenly we gained much more brain power, much more brain capacity, and it hasn't yet been fully satisfactorily explained how that occurred. It may be possible that this so-called missing link is actually the extraterrestrials that came to Earth so long ago and injected their DNA into the early hominid in order to create Homo sapiens. As humans were created, then they began to act as a workforce to help accelerate the mining operations that were so important to the ETs and allowed them to accomplish their task within a timely manner. However, the idea is that because the ETs were so advanced, these early humans began to kind of look upon them as godlike beings, and they began to think of them as something far above humanity. Also, the ETs may have acted to keep the humans at a certain level. In many of the stories that exist in early documents, such as the Bible, these stories are told, but they have been sort of mythologized. And I think they do represent something a little bit more literal. When it talks about the idea, such as the Garden of Eden, and how the gods did not want humans to be as smart as they are, to know the things that they knew, and how eating from the tree of knowledge caused them to be expelled from the Garden of Eden, so to speak. This may be a metaphor for what actually happened in terms of humans seeing the gods and wanting to understand what the gods knew, what the ETs knew. But the ETs wanted to prevent that, because then they would be like them and they would know the things they knew, and they couldn't necessarily use them as labor anymore. They would want independence, as any thinking being probably does. So they curtailed their knowledge, they curtailed their ability perhaps even to learn that knowledge by not necessarily turning on certain markers in our DNA, and by leaving those markers off, preventing us from actually being able to learn too much of what the ETs knew and how they operated, so that we wouldn't become equal to them. So the idea is that eventually the extraterrestrials on the planet that these beings came from may have in fact learned about what these ETs had done in creating Homo sapiens. Now, as far as the story goes, it's possible that they have breached their own laws by doing this. It may not have been something that they were actually allowed to do in creating a sentient species. And so the story goes that they were recalled to their own planet, and that from that point forward, once Homo sapiens had been created, the ETs that had recalled the group that came to Earth knew that they couldn't just abandon mankind. They had to guide them from that point forward until they were assured that mankind could perhaps take care of themselves, could understand basic relationships and basic laws, and could create a society that was self-sustaining. And so the ETs sought to teach mankind things like agriculture and mathematics and so on, so that humankind could become self-sustaining. But I think this is where the stories come from, of visitations from the gods over time. to lead us on certain paths, to teach us certain things, to watch over us and guide us. And this relationship, I think, solidified the idea that eventually became the religions of the world, where we know that there is something observing us. We know that there is something higher than us. Now, this in no way, shape, or form negates the idea of the spiritual nature of God or the spiritual nature of humanity. But I think these things have become enmeshed. These two stories have become intertwined and enmeshed with one another. And therefore, there is nowadays no separation between the idea of God as a spirit and the souls of humanity and the idea of who created us. But I think these are actually two distinctly different stories. While we do have a spiritual beginning, I think we also have a different physical beginning that began, as this story tells us, with the ETs that came to Earth and created Homo sapiens. But they have stayed around to guide us after recalling the group that created us, being that creation was against their laws. So in guiding us, we now have all the stories of being led through the desert, of being taught how to build certain devices, how to create societies, how to have relationships. And this comes across, because the stories have been intertwined, as things like commandments from God, which I think in the early days was simply teaching humanity ways to live, ways to understand how not to fight each other and so on and so forth, how to get along, so that they knew that they could eventually leave us to our own devices and that we could build societies that would one day allow us to sort of reclaim our position among the stars, being the children of extraterrestrial beings. So as the story goes, the way the ETs gave us the information that we needed is they literally came down to Earth. They taught us, they showed us how to do things practically. A lot of the old stories of wheels in the sky and fiery demons landing on top of mountaintops and dispensing information can literally be thought of as the ETs coming down to Earth, showing themselves, and literally sort of taking us by the hand and saying, this is the way you do this. This is how you plant seeds. This is how you build these things. These are the tools you need. And when humanity learned enough, then the ETs sought to sort of, again, leave humanity on its own. They may have guided us with their ships. They may have sent messages down to Earth now and then, messengers who gave us the information we may have needed at that moment. But they mostly started leaving us to our own devices, according to the story, so that again, they would watch, they would guide from afar, and over time, have less and less contact with us to see where we would take the information that they imparted to us, to see if we could survive on our own, if we could learn to build a civilization. Now, of course, because of all of the information being at cross purposes in the beginning, because they had a different reason for creating us than eventually what came to be, our independence was really a very different goal from what they originally intended, the group that created Homo sapiens. So a lot of this information has gotten mixed up over time and lost over time in the different civilizations that have evolved on Earth, so that we're not really sure now exactly what is an indication of what physically really happened and what is simply a legend, a story, a mythology. And so nowadays we are attempting to look back at history from our new understanding with our education, with our science, with our evolutionary understanding. We're trying to look back and say, what can we separate out from the stories and the mythologies? What actually really happened back then? Because it does appear that some of the stories may have a basis in fact, but has become wrapped up in the mythology, in the legends. And so it's very difficult, very challenging nowadays to understand what really may have physically happened from what may have been embellished over time for a variety of either social or religious or political purposes. Because again, mankind being left on its own has to guess a lot, has to speculate, has to explore and experiment and discover. And some things that we have discovered lead us to believe now that some of these stories may in fact be more literal than we thought. Not all of them necessarily. Some of them still remain clouded in myth. But we are digging down, we are discovering new things, and the more we seem to dig up, the more history seems to validate some of these stories as being things that actually did happen. Maybe not exactly in the way we think, but they do seem to have a basis in fact. And we are now at this day and age learning to slowly extract the truth from the myths so that we can learn more about where we truly came from, what is our actual history, and how much did ETs really play a part in creating our civilization, in creating Homo sapiens. Because if that is really true, and we are the offshoot of this genetic breeding program, then our ancestors are both the natural hominid that evolved upon the earth and also the ETs that came to this planet and gave us their DNA and created what essentially are hybrid beings. Homo sapiens, in a sense, may already be a hybridized civilization. This also leads to the idea that we may contain a lot more abilities than we think. People that exhibit certain kinds of gifts, psychic functioning, precognition, telepathy, so on and so forth, may in fact be exhibiting the result of this extraterrestrial genetic infusion into us so long ago. So there may be things and abilities that we have that we can, shall we say, take from what we were given from the ET genetics. And now that we are investigating and expanding our own consciousness, now that more and more people are exploring the idea of what consciousness is, what genetics and DNA really are all about, we have found that there may be certain aspects of our consciousness and certain aspects of our DNA that have been a mystery to us that we are now beginning to learn may have been the result of this extraterrestrial breeding program. There's a lot of things in our DNA that scientists have been referring to as junk DNA because they're not exactly sure what it does, why it's there. That may be the remnant of the genetic markers from the extraterrestrials. As we discover more about our DNA, it seems that a lot more markers that were dormant are turning on as we expand our consciousness, as we discover more abilities, more awareness, as we explore farther and farther out into space and into the realm of consciousness. And we may be, in a sense, recapturing our ET heritage. We may suddenly have more of the abilities that the ETs were said to have, that the gods were said to have. So they could do all of these marvelous things that early humans marveled at, but we may find that those skills, those abilities are inherent within us as well as the result of the infusion of the extraterrestrial genetics that created us to be the Homo sapiens, the human race that we are today. When the extraterrestrials decided to inject their own DNA into certain branches of the early hominids that naturally evolved on Earth, such as Homo erectus, they didn't necessarily alter every single branch of these early hominids. According to the information that's come from Bashar through the channelings, those branches of Homo erectus and other early hominids that were not included in the early genetic experiments from the extraterrestrials continue to evolve naturally on the Earth and eventually became what we now refer to as Sasquatch. So the idea is that if the ETs had not intervened, had not given their DNA to certain branches of the early hominids, and we had all been allowed to evolve naturally, we would all be Sasquatch today. Now, the Sasquatch have evolved apparently to have certain abilities as well. They are very difficult to find. And according to the channeled information, it is because they can do something that's called slipwalking, which means they naturally evolve the ability to sort of shift in and out of our dimension of reality. They can hide themselves this way. They can avoid Homo sapiens in this way when they need to. And one of the reasons they may be avoiding Homo sapiens is because they recognize that we are the offshoots of the extraterrestrials that came here and changed their early ancestors in order to create this workforce to help them with this mining project that they had. And so they may have felt that we became a little bit too alien for the naturally evolved hominid as they continue to evolve along a more natural path and became Sasquatch, which is the naturally evolved hominid of the earth. So the idea of going back even farther about where we came from involves a concept that scientists have called panspermia. Panspermia is the idea that certain kinds of biological elements of DNA, can travel through space on comets and meteors. And when they land on another planet, they actually seed that planet with that DNA material, which can then, based on the conditions of that particular planet, allow that DNA to blossom, to grow, to combine molecularly, to become the precursor for life on that planet as it happened on Earth. So our DNA may have originated on another planet, another solar system, even another galaxy entirely. And when it arrived on Earth and began the process of evolution as the molecules combined under the proper conditions, it may have given rise to the beings that naturally evolved on Earth and eventually led to the naturally evolved hominid called Homo erectus, at which point the Anunnaki then changed that evolutionary path by giving over to their DNA the human species, the Homo sapiens, creating us to be something that sort of jumped out of that evolutionary path. The natural hominids eventually evolving over the eons into Sasquatch may in fact have watched all of this happen from their own perspective, from their own position, and may not necessarily be capable of really relating to us because we became kind of the aliens on Earth. So we may eventually find that we can communicate once again with our ancestors, with the Sasquatch beings, Bigfoot, Yeti, by all the names they go by. Eventually, as we expand ourselves, as we learn of our true origins, as we relate to the idea of nature on Earth, as we become less foreign, in a sense, to the Earth, by reclaiming and recapturing our humanity, our ancestry, we may be able to eventually create communication with the Sasquatch and rejoin that particular branch of humanity. But we will see if that happens one day. This is a very complex story with many different angles to it, many different perspectives to it. But it is the story overall of humanity. It is the story overall of where we came from, according to the channeled information that I brought through. So it's a very interesting story that has many, many chapters to it, has many different points of view to it. And it is something that we can continue to investigate until ultimately, perhaps one day, we will know the entire story of humanity, the entire story of our galactic family that we belong to, and we will be able to tell that story to the next generation and the next generation so they can continue to evolve to wherever it is humanity is heading, perhaps going from Homo sapiens to Homo galacticus. Now, I have mentioned that because of the Anunnaki's introduction of their genetics into the early hominid, Homo sapiens became a kind of hybrid species already. And later on in the series, we're going to talk about another introduction, another infusion of extraterrestrial genetics to create a different kind of hybrid. And this will eventually dovetail into the evolution of humanity. but we will get to that later on. One other thing I would like to add that goes hand in hand with the evolution of life on Earth is going back to the panspermia idea, because people have often wondered, well, a lot of these extraterrestrials come to Earth. Why do they look so human? Why are they so similar to us? And I think, as the channeling has explained, panspermia can kind of happen in clusters in different areas in the galaxy, so that one kind of DNA might infuse planets in one area of the galaxy, and another kind of DNA, another arrangement of DNA, might infuse planets in another area of the galaxy. So there might be pockets in the galaxy of the kind of DNA that, when it finds the right conditions on a planet, may actually evolve into humanoid species. And that may be why a lot of the extraterrestrials we hear reports of also look very much like human beings. Or perhaps even more appropriately, we look like them. For example, Bashar's people are humanoid, but they are related to us genetically. And again, that may be what a lot of scientists are missing, because when they say, well, why are these aliens all looking human? They may have had the answer all along, but really missed the point. And that is that all the ones that do look somewhat human may in fact be genetically related to us, and therefore aren't exactly as alien as we may think. The idea of self can only exist if there is an idea or an experience of other than self. From the channeled information that has come through me, the very existence of space and time, in a sense, is proof of parallel realities. It's all the same moment from a different point of view, from a different perspective. Humans have for a while had this great fear that if we create artificial intelligence, it's going to become so superior to us that it's going to wipe us out. Well, he's saying true intelligence, true artificial intelligence would never do that, because it understands that humans are part of the whole system.